Wyoming, 1876. Moonlight silvered the frostbitten plains where rancher Elias Ward lived a life of solitary atonement. One bitter night, a choked cry shattered the silence. He found her, a young Cherokee woman, bound with cruel rawhide to a gnarled cottonwood. Terror wore with defiance in her bruised eyes. Who left her to die in his wilderness? And what dark reckoning followed her trail through the wind's lonely cry? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The silence of the Wyoming high plains in deep winter wasn't truly silent. It was a vast, breathing entity, composed of the wind's low moan through dry sagebrush, the brittle crackle of frost expanding on the cabin's lone window pane, and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the iron stove cooling in the corner. Elias Ward sat within its meager circle of warmth, a tin mug of weak coffee growing cold between his scarred hands. Outside, the world lay frozen under a sky thick with stars, indifferent and impossibly distant. The cabin, little more than a sturdy box of weathered pine logs chinked with mud and straw, held the chill at bay, but it couldn't touch the deeper cold that had settled in Elias's bones years ago. 46 winters had etched their passage onto his face. Lines carved deep around eyes the color of storm-washed flint, a jaw perpetually clenched against memory, skin weathered to the texture of old saddle leather. He wore a thick wool shirt, patched at the elbows, and trousers tucked into worn boots caked with dried mud. A single plate, chipped enamel, sat empty on the rough-hewn table beside him. The only adornment in the sparse room was a small, obsidian arrowhead, smooth and dark, hung by a leather thong from a nail near the door. His gaze drifted to it now, a familiar anchor in the sea of his solitude. It wasn't a trophy. It was a weight, a silent testament to a life he'd tried to bury under the endless toil of this hardscrabble ranch. The wind shifted, keening around the eaves like a lost spirit. Elias stirred, the worn chair groaning beneath him. He reached for the poker to stir the banked coals in the stove, seeking a few more embers of warmth. That's when he heard it. Not the wind, not the settling timbers. A sound that didn't belong to the indifferent night or his lonely vigil. A whimper, faint, choked, barely audible above the elements. It could have been a coyote pup, injured and freezing. But something in its pitch, its human desperation, froze Elias mid-motion. He held his breath, listening intently. The vast silence pressed back. Had he imagined it? A trick of the wind whistling through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods, lining the frozen creek bed 100 yards south? His knuckles whitened on the poker. Years of living on the knife edge of survival, years spent listening for threats in the dark, had honed his senses. He hadn't imagined it. Setting the poker down silently, Elias moved with a predator's caution, honed by necessity, not malice. He shrugged into his heavy buffalo coat, its familiar smell of wood smoke and animal musk a comfort against the unknown. From a peg near the door, he lifted his Henry rifle, the cold metal a familiar weight. He didn't light a lantern. The moon, riding high and pale in the clear sky, cast enough ghostly light to navigate by. He eased the door open, the hinges protesting with a low groan that sounded unnaturally loud in stillness. The cold hit him like a physical blow, sharp and dry, stealing his breath. Frost crunched under his boots as he stepped onto the hard-packed earth of the small yard. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust, scanning the monochrome landscape, the silvered sagebrush flats stretching towards distant, snow-dusted ridges, the dark ribbon of the cottonwood grove marking the creek. The wind knifed through his coat, carrying the scent of frozen earth and distant snow. Silence. Then there, again, a ragged gasp, more a sob caught in the throat, coming from the direction of the trees. Not an animal. Human. Suffering. Elias moved south, rifle held loosely but ready, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The crunch of his steps on the frozen ground seemed obscenely loud. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their leafless branches clawing at the star-strewn sky like skeletal fingers. Moonlight filtered through, dappling the frozen ground beneath with shifting patterns of light and deep shadow. He moved slower now, every sense straining. The sound came again, closer, a low moan, thick with pain and fear. He saw her. She was lashed to the thick trunk of the oldest cottonwood, the one scarred by lightning years past. Rawhide strips, pulled savagely tight, bound her wrists high above her head, forcing her onto her toes. Her ankles were similarly secured, the bindings biting deep into the soft leather of her moccasins and the flesh beneath. She hung there, a broken doll suspended in the moonlight. Her head was slumped forward, long, dark hair, partially braided, obscure in her face, falling over the shoulders of a torn, doeskin tunic. Even in the pale light, Elias could see the dark smudges of bruises marring her exposed arms and neck. A trickle of dried blood traced a path from her temple down her cheekbone. Elias stopped dead, a cold fury, colder than the Wyoming night, rising in his chest, momentarily eclipsing caution. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the familiarity of it. A flash seared his mind. Not this girl, but another figure, bound and helpless, pleading eyes meeting his own before. He slammed the memory shut, the taste of bile sharp in his throat. The obsidian arrowhead seemed to burn against his ribs beneath his shirt. He approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding shadows, rifle half raised. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, sounding alien in the stillness. "Easy." At the sound, her head jerked up. Moonlight illuminated a face of startling youth, perhaps 17 or 18, yet etched with terror and pain that made her seem both older and heartbreakingly vulnerable. High cheekbones, wide-set eyes dark as obsidian chips, now wide with animal panic. Her lips were cracked, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that misted the air. She tried to shrink back against the unforgiving bark, a trapped creature seeing only another predator. Elias lowered the rifle, holding his hands out slowly, palms open. He kept his voice low, calm, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "I ain't gonna hurt you. My name's Elias. Elias Ward. This is my land. Who did this?" Her eyes darted frantically, not meeting his, scanning the darkness beyond the trees, towards the east. Fear radiated from her like heat from a stove. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped her bruised throat. She swallowed convulsively, tried again. Please?" The word was a broken whisper, barely audible. "Go, run, run." Elias frowned, stepping closer. The rawhide was cruelly tight, cutting into her skin. He could see the raw abrasions on her wrists. "Who tied you here, girl? Why?" She shook her head violently, a sob catching in her chest. Her voice gained a sliver of strength, laced with a desperate urgency. "They come. For me. You danger. Go!" Her dark eyes finally locked onto his, pleading not for herself, but for him. "Please run." That spark of defiance, that warning issued even as she hung broken and terrified, struck Elias deep. It wasn't just fear. It was a fierce, protective instinct directed at a stranger. It cut through his own hardened shell. He saw the raw terror, yes, but beneath it, a resilience as unyielding as the cottonwood itself. He remembered the arrowhead, the weight of choices made long ago. He couldn't run. Not this time. Not tonight, he stated, his voice low but firm, a decision settling into his bones as solid as the frozen earth. He pulled the heavy skinning knife from the sheath at his belt. The blade gleamed dully in the moonlight. "Hold still." He moved swiftly then, the rancher momentarily replaced by the decisive, dangerous man he used to be. He sawed carefully at the thick rawhide binding her wrists first, mindful of the knife's edge near her skin. The leather parted with a dry snap. Her arms fell limply to her sides with a gasp of pain as circulation returned. She sagged, her legs buckling, only held upright by the bindings at her ankles. Elias knelt, working quickly on those knots. They were complex, viciously tight. the work of men who took pleasure in cruelty. Anger simmered, cold and clean, as he finally severed the last strip. She collapsed forward as the final restraint gave way. Elias caught her before she hit the frozen ground, her slight frame shockingly light, and icy cold even through his coat. She was trembling violently, shock setting in. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on his face mere inches away. Her breath was shallow, rapid. She smelled of sweat, fear, blood, and the faint, earthy scent of sage. "Got you," Elias murmured, gathering her carefully, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. Her head lolled against his shoulder. She weighed next to nothing. "Ain't leaving you out here." He scanned the eastern horizon again, the direction her terrified gaze had indicated. Nothing but the endless, moonlit expanse and the brooding silhouette of distant hills. But the girl's fear was a palpable thing, a contagion in the still air. "They come." He turned, carrying his fragile burden back toward the cabin. Her body was a tense bundle against him, every muscle coiled with residual terror and the agony of released bindings. She didn't struggle, but her breathing remained shallow and fast. As they neared the cabin, the weak yellow glow from the single window spilled onto the frosty ground. Elias kicked the door open wider and carried her inside, kicking it shut behind him with his heel. The sudden warmth of the cabin after the biting cold was almost shocking. He laid her gently on the narrow cot tucked against the far wall, the only bed in the single room. She immediately tried to curl into a defensive ball, drawing her knees up, her wide, dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, the rough log walls, the glowing stove, the single table and chair, the hanging arrowhead. With renewed suspicion warring with exhaustion, she shivered uncontrollably. Elias moved to the stove, banking the coals higher and adding a few split logs of dry pine. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. He filled the battered tin kettle from a water bucket and set it on the stove top to heat. He grabbed a relatively clean cloth from a shelf and dipped it into the remaining water in the bucket, wringing it out. He approached the cot slowly, holding the damp cloth where she could see it. "Need to clean that cut," he said, his voice deliberately neutral. He gestured toward the blood on her temple. "Won't hurt you." She flinched as he reached out, but held still, watching him with the unwavering intensity of a cornered doe. Elias dabbed gently at the dried blood. It wasn't a deep cut, more a nasty scrape, probably from being thrown against a tree. The cold water seemed to rouse her slightly. Her shivering lessened marginally. He saw more bruises now, blooming purple and blue along her jawline, the outline of fingers on her upper arm. Fury tightened his gut again, but he kept his touch light, impersonal. The kettle began a low whistle. Elias rose, poured some hot water into a tin cup, added a splash of cold from the bucket, and stirred in a small spoonful of honey, a rare luxury he kept for times of sickness. He brought it back to the cot. "Here," he offered, holding the cup out. "Drink. Warm you up. Got honey in it." She stared at the cup, then at his face, her expression unreadable. Hunger and thirst war with ingrained distrust. Slowly, cautiously, she uncurled a little, accepting the cup with both hands. Her fingers trembled so violently the hot, liquid sloshed near the rim. She brought it to her lips, sipped tentatively, then drank deeply, the warmth visibly spreading through her. She lowered the cup, her eyes meeting his again. The raw terror had subsided, replaced by a deep, wary exhaustion and a flicker of something else. Perhaps reluctant gratitude, perhaps just a day's relief of survival. "Name?" Elias asked quietly, squatting on his haunches beside the cot to be less imposing. She hesitated, her gaze drifting past him, lingering for a moment on the obsidian arrowhead hanging by the door. A shadow crossed her face. "Ahyoka," she whispered, the name soft as wind through grass. "They call me Ahyoka." Her voice was still rough, but clearer. "Ahyoka," Elias repeated. It felt like a fragile gift, her name. "Who are they, Ahyoka? Who did this?" "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, a sound pierced the relative quiet of the cabin, a sound that turned the warmth to ice in Elias's veins. Distant, carried on the capricious wind, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, not the single, leisurely plod of a lone rider. This was a hard, rhythmic drumming of multiple horses, moving fast, riding hard, coming from the east. Ahyoka heard it too, her head snapped up, eyes widening anew with pure dread. The tin cup slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the dirt floor, the dregs of honeyed water soaking into the earth. She didn't seem to notice. Her gaze locked onto Elias, filled with a silent, desperate plea that echoed the chilling cadence growing steadily louder outside the thin walls of the cabin. "They come," she breathed, the words barely audible over the sudden frantic hammering of Elias's own heart. The wind outside seemed to carry the sound, amplifying it, transforming the vast, silent plains into a drumskin tightening with every beat. The fragile piece of the cabin, the tentative spark of connection, shattered like ice under a boot heel. The night held its breath, waiting. The riders were closing in. The drumming hooves, a relentless pulse against the vast silence, seemed to shake the very timbers of the cabin. Elias moved on instinct honed in darker days. He lunged for the heavy wooden bar leaning near the door, hefting it with a grunt and slamming it down into the wrought iron brackets. The solid thunk was swallowed by the approaching thunder. He spun, grabbing the Henry rifle from where it leaned against the wall near the hanging obsidian arrowhead. Its cold weight was a grim comfort. Ahyoka had scrambled back on the cot, pressing herself against the rough-hewn logs, eyes wide pools of terror reflecting the firelight. Her breath hitched in ragged gasps, her knuckles white where she gripped the thin woolen blanket Elias had draped over her earlier. The spilled cup lay forgotten on the dirt floor, a dark stain spreading. "Stay down," Elias commanded, his voice low and tight. He crossed the single, small window, its panes thick with frost at the edges. Carefully, he eased the latch and pushed the lower pane open just a crack, enough to see out, not enough to offer an easy target. The frigid night air sliced in, carrying the sound clearer now. Multiple riders, moving fast, still some distance off but closing. They weren't heading directly for the cabin yet, perhaps veering slightly south toward the creek and the fateful cottonwood. He scanned the moon-washed landscape. Nothing moved but the wind-tossed sagebrush, silvered and spectral. The riders remained unseen, their presence announced only by that ominous rhythm vibrating through the frozen earth. He strained his ears, filtering the wind's moan. Was that a shout? A harsh laugh, snatched and carried away? Impossible to tell. The hoofbeats reached a crescendo somewhere near the creek grove, then began to fade, not retreating, but circling, slowing, hunting. Elias held his breath, finger resting lightly beside the rifle's trigger. The sound diminished further, becoming intermittent, then finally ceasing, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier, more charged than before. The wind resumed its lonely keening around the cabin eaves. "They stopped," Ahyoka whispered, the words trembling. "By the water." Elias eased the window shut, latching it firmly. The sudden quiet inside was oppressive, thick with unspoken fear. He turned back to the room, the firelight painting shifting patterns on his grim face. Ahyoka hadn't relaxed. She remained coiled tight, watching him, watching the door, listening to wind as if it carried hidden voices. "Need to see," Elias muttered, more to himself than her. He couldn't sit blind. He grabbed his heavy buffalo coat, shrugging it on. "Bar stays. Don't open for anyone but me. Here." She nodded mutely, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her gaze flickered again to the obsidian arrowhead near the door, a question unspoken in her dark eyes. Elias lifted the bar just enough to slip out, then swiftly replaced it from the outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow after the cabin's fog. Frost crunched loudly under his boots as he moved away from the door, hugging the deep shadows cast by the cabin wall. The moon, riding high now, bleached the landscape bone white. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, circling wide to approach the creek grove in the north, using a low rise for cover. He reached the crest and crouched behind a clump of frozen sage. Below, the cottonwood stood like sentinels, their tangled branches stark against the starfield. Moonlight glinted on the frozen surface of the shallow creek. And there, near the base of the lightning-scarred tree where he'd found Ahyoka, shapes moved. 3 men, maybe 4, indistinct in the gloom, dismounted. Their horses, dark silhouettes, stamped in blue plumes of steam into the frigid air. He could hear the murmur of voices now, low and rough, though the words were lost in the wind. One man bent near the tree trunk, examining the severed rawhide strips Elias had left dangling. He gestured angrily, his movements sharp and violent in the moonlight. Another kicked at the frozen ground nearby. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle stock. He could take a shot from here, create chaos, maybe drop one, but against 3 or 4. And what if he missed? It would bring them straight to the cabin, where Ahyoka was defenseless. The cold knot of helplessness tightened in his gut, warring with the old, familiar urge for violence. He thought of the arrowhead, a silent reproach. Not that way. Not again. He watched motionless as the men conferred. One pointed toward the cabin, a dark shape on a rise to the north. Elias froze, but the others seemed to argue, shaking their heads, gesturing back toward the east. After a tense minute, they mounted up. With a final, frustrated glance towards the cabin, the leader wheeled his horse, and the small group spurred away, following the frozen creek bed eastward. Quickly swallowed by the night, the drumming of hooves faded once more, leaving only the wind in Elias's own thudding heart. He waited a long time, until the cold seeped deep into his bones and the silence felt absolute again. Only then did he move, slipping down the slope toward the tree. The ground around it was churned with hoof prints and boot marks. Near where Ahyoka's feet had been bound, something small and metallic glinted in the moonlight, half-trodden into the frozen mud. Elias bent and picked it up. A spur rowel, one point bent, the leather strap broken. Cheap, rough iron. The mark of hard, careless men. He pocketed it, a cold, hard weight against his leg. Back at the cabin, he gave the low, prearranged whistle before lifting the bar and slipping inside. Ahyoka was exactly where he'd left her, but her eyes held a slightly less frantic terror, replaced by a deep, exhausted wariness. "They're gone," Elias said, replacing the bar with finality. For now, circled the tree, argued, rode east. He held out the bent spur rowel. "Drop this." Ahyoka flinched at the sight of it, drawing back as if it were a snake. "Harlan's men," she breathed, the name thick with loathing. "Harlan." Elias moved to the stove, adding another log. The fire hissed and spat, casting welcome warmth. "Jasper Harlan." Her voice was low, trembling slightly but steadier than before. She stared into the flames, her face a mask of remembered pain. "He claims the land. All the land. The water. The hunting grounds my people have walked since before the grandfathers of his grandfathers were born." She wrapped her arms around herself. "He has papers. Papers from men far away who never saw this earth, never tasted its wind. He says we are trespassers, thieves." Elias grunted. Land greed, a story as old as the hills, and just as brutal. He'd seen it before, the way paper promises could drown older truths in blood. "He did this to you? Tied you?" The image of her bound form, the bruises, ignited the cold fury again. Ahyoka shook her head, a bitter twist to her lips. "His men, led by Silas Rourke, a wolf with a man's skin." She shuddered. "They came to our camp 2 suns past, offered protection for a price, grain, furs, women." The word women was a whisper of pure venom. "When we refused," she trailed off, touching the bruise on her jawline. "They took me, said I was leverage, to make my uncle listen, to make him sign Harlan's paper, giving it all away. Her voice cracked. My uncle, Conatai, he would never. They knew he wouldn't trade land for flesh. So, Rourke, he said if Conatai wouldn't take the trade, then Harlan would take me, a different kind of property. She spat the word. They'd bound me, left me here. Rourke said it was a message for anyone who might help, that Harlan owns everything the moon touches here. She looked up at Elias, her eyes dark pools of despair mixed with a flicker of defiance. They meant for me to freeze, or for the wolves, or... She didn't finish. Elias felt the old shame rise, sour and familiar. He'd run with men like Rourke once, men who saw people as obstacles or commodities. The memory was a physical ache, a shadow that clung like the cabin's chill. He walked to the shelf, not looking at her, and picked up a small object. It was a smooth river stone, dark gray streaked with white quartz, worn by centuries of water. He'd found it years ago, the day he decided to stop running, to try and bury his past in this hard ground. It fit perfectly in his palm, cool and grounding. He turned back to Ahyoka, holding out the stone. Here, he said, his voice rough, holds the cold. Put it near that bruise. Helps. She stared at the stone, then at his face, searching. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his calloused palm, a fleeting, electric contact. She cupped the smooth stone in both hands, its coolness a counterpoint to her feverish fear. She brought it to the bruise on her jaw, closed her eyes for a moment. A small sigh escaped her, not quite relief, but a lessening of tension. Thank you, Elias Ward, she whispered. He nodded, awkwardly, turning back to the stove to poke the fire, needing to busy his hands. The silence stretched, but it was different now, less charged with imminent threat, more filled with the shared weight of their respective pasts pressing against the thin walls of the present. He saw her lift her head, her gaze drifting towards a shuttered window, listening to the wind. Then, very softly, almost below the threshold of hearing, she began to hum. It was a low, mournful melody, weaving to the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. It held the cadence of flowing water and the sigh of wind through pines, a sound ancient and sorrowful, yet carrying an undercurrent of profound resilience. A song of her people, a thread connecting her to a world beyond these walls, beyond the reach of Jasper Harlan's greed. Elias stopped poking the fire, listening. It filled the small cabin with a strange, poignant peace, a fragile counterpoint to the violence outside. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine smoke and cold earth filling his lungs. Does Conatai, your uncle, he wouldn't give you up. Would he come looking? Ahyoka stopped humming. She lowered the stone, her expression hardening. He would tear the earth apart, she stated, her voice gaining strength. He is an IGA to GYS due, a peace chief, but as hard as a warrior's when his blood is threatened. He would follow. He is following. Her eyes met Elias's, fierce and certain. But Harlan's men, Rourke, they watch the trails. They have rifles that shoot far. My people, we travel quietly, but against many guns. The unspoken fear hung in the air. Could her clan reach her before Harlan's men return in force? Elias thought of the bent spur, the angry men at the tree, the vast emptiness that could hide a pursuing clan just as easily as it hid predators. He thought of his single rifle, the flimsy bar on the door, the girl shivering on his cot. The weight felt crushing. He walked to the window again, easing the shutter open a fraction. The eastern horizon was a dark smudge against the lesser dark of the sky. He scanned, searching for any sign, a campfire spark, a moving shadow. Nothing. Then he saw it. Not movement, not light, but the absence of light. A patch of the star-strewn sky, low on the eastern horizon, was blotted out, not by clouds. The night was clear, by smoke, a thin, dark column rising, barely visible against the black, dissipating as it rose, but unmistakable. A campfire, recently lit or banked, perhaps 5, 6 miles off, near the base of the distant hills, right where the riders had disappeared. He felt Ahyoka's presence beside him. She had risen silently from the cot, the blanket draped around her shoulders. She followed his gaze, her sharp eyes finding the smoke plume instantly. A low sound escaped her, a mixture of dread and grim understanding. "They are waiting," she said, her voice barely a breath. The mournful melody was gone, replaced by a chilling certainty. "They know I am here. They know you are here. The message, it was also for you, Elias Ward. They are waiting for dawn." She turned her head, looking not east toward the smoke, but north into vast, trackless darkness beyond the creek, her expression one of desperate, silent pleading. "Where are you, Conatii?" The fragile peace woven by her song shattered. The cold night pressed in, no longer just a season, but a premonition. Elias stared at the distant smoke, a dark stain on the horizon, a beacon not of warmth, but of patient menace. The riders weren't gone. They were camped, biding their time, waiting for the first gray light to come and finish what they'd started. The weight of the coming dawn settled over the cabin, heavy and suffocating. They were trapped. The night held its breath, counting down the hours. The smoke plume on the eastern horizon was a serpent's breath, coiling lazily against the deepening indigo of the pre-dawn sky. It spoke not of warmth, but of patient menace, a dark exhalation staining the vast canvas of the Wyoming night. Inside the cabin, the silence was a taut wire, vibrating with the unspoken dread of what the creeping light would bring. The fire Elias had banked high after returning from his scout cast long, leaping shadows that danced like restless spirits on the rough log walls, the only counterpoint to the low, mournful sigh of the wind probing the eaves. Elias stood at the shuttered window, his eye pressed to the narrow crack he'd maintained. The cold air seeped in, a physical reminder of the world outside, a world shrinking with every passing minute. He scanned the frost-bleached expanse, the silvered sagebrush, the dark line of the cottonwood grove, the distant, brooding hills where the serpent smoke coiled. Nothing moved, yet the stillness felt charged, expectant. He knew the men were out there, huddled around their fire, waiting for the gray hour to make their move, waiting for him, waiting for her. Ahyoka sat on the edge of the cot, the worn wool blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. The smooth river stone Elias had given her was clutched in one hand, pressed against the bruise on her jaw. Her other hand rested lightly on the stock of the Henry rifle, leaning against the cot beside her. In the flickering firelight, her face was a study and contained turmoil, the lingering ghost of terror in her wide eyes, the tight set of her mouth, but beneath it, a core of fierce resolve that seemed to harden with each passing moment. She wasn't just waiting, she was steeling herself. "They won't come quiet," Elias said, his voice a low rasp in the stillness. He didn't turn from the window. "Likely try to flush us out first. Shouts, threats, maybe try the door." Ahyoka nodded, a small, sharp movement. "Silas Rourke. He likes fear. He feeds on it, like a coyote on weakness." Her voice was steady, clearer now, carrying an edge of cold hatred that cut through her exhaustion. "He will try to make you give me up, or make me run." Elias finally turned, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers in the dim light. The obsidian arrowhead hanging by the door seemed to draw his gaze for a fraction of a second, a familiar weight. "Ain't happening," he stated flatly. The simplicity of it brooked no argument. He pushed away from the window, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. He moved to the table, picking up a small leather pouch containing his spare cartridges. The metallic clink as he spilled a few onto the ruffle was unnaturally loud. He glanced at Ahyoka, then back at the cartridges. An idea, born of grim necessity, took root. "You ever handle a rifle?" he asked. Ahyoka shook her head. "My uncle, he taught me to bow. For hunting. Not this." Her gesture encompassed the rifle, the cabin, the unseen threat beyond. "Bow's quiet. This..." Elias hefted the Henry, its weight and purpose undeniable. This speaks loud. Sometimes that's all you got. He hesitated. The image of his younger self, reckless and violent, flashing unwanted before his eyes, teaching someone, especially her, to use this tool of his darker past felt like tempting fate. But survival trumped ghosts. Need another set of hands that knows what it's doing if things get close. If I'm occupied. He couldn't bring himself to voice the worst possibilities. He laid the rifle carefully on the table beside the cartridges. "Watch," he said, his voice adopting the patient, deliberate tone of a man explaining a complex knot. He broke open the rifle's action. "This is a lever. Pull it down, forward." He demonstrated the smooth, oiled movement. Chamber opens here. Cartridge slides in. He picked up a brass cartridge, the firelight glinting dully on its casing, pointy end forward. Then he closed the lever with decisive click. "She's ready. Hammer back here." He thumbed it to full cock, the sound sharp and final. "Aim. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Smooth." He eased the hammer down a half cock, the safer position. "Only ever pointed at something you mean to kill." Ahyoka watched intently, her dark eyes absorbing every movement, every detail. She rose from the cot, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and stepped closer to the table. The fear was still there, but it was overlaid now with a focused intensity. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the cold metal of the receiver. "May I?" Elias nodded, stepping back slightly. "Go slow." Her touch was tentative at first, then firmer as she mimicked his actions, pulling the lever down and forward, peering into the open chamber. She picked up a cartridge, her fingers trembling only slightly as she slid it into the breech. She closed the lever, the click-clack echoing in the quiet cabin. Her thumb found the hammer, drawing it back to full cock with deliberate care. The weight of the loaded rifle in her hand seemed to settle something within her, replacing helplessness with a fragile sense of agency. She looked at Elias, a question in her eyes. "Good," he said, a flicker of something akin to respect in his gaze. "Now ease the hammer down to here." He pointed to the half-cock notch. She did so, the mechanism moving smoothly under her guidance. "If they breach that door," Elias continued, his voice low and grave, "you get behind the stove. Use it for cover. Aim low. Legs, belly. Stop him coming. Don't think, just act. Understand?" "I understand," Ahyoka whispered, lowering the hammer fully. She broke the action again, ejecting the unfired cartridge, catching it deftly before it hit the table. The unspoken gravity of the lesson hung between them, a terrible intimacy forged in the face of annihilation. She placed the cartridge back on the table, her hand lingering for a moment beside the rifle. "My people, we have a prayer," she said softly, her gaze drifting toward the shuttered window, towards the unseen east, for strength, for the dawn to bring truth, not blood. She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving silently. When she opened them, there was a deeper calm, a rootedness that hadn't been there before. "Kanati taught me," he said, even in the shadow of the wolf, "the rabbit remembers the sun." Elias felt a pang, sharp and unexpected. Her quiet faith, her connection to something older and deeper than the greed of Jasper Harlan, resonated against the barren landscape of his own past. He had no prayers left, only the weight of actions taken and debts unpaid. He looked away, busying himself with checking the bar on the door again, testing its solidity. "Sun will be up soon," he muttered, the words tasting like ash. As if summoned by his words, the first, faintest tinge of gray began to bleed into the blackness at the edge of the eastern horizon. It was a cold, colorless light, leaching the vibrancy from the stars, turning the world into a monochrome etching. Elias returned to his vigil at the window crack. The smoke plume was more distinct now, a dirty smudge against the paling sky. He scanned the nearer landscape, the frost-covered sagebrush taking on form and shadow. His gaze swept over the frozen creek, the cottonwoods standing like stark, silent witnesses. Movement. His breath caught in his throat, not near the smoke, but closer, much closer, down by the creek, near the base of the cottonwood grove. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows beneath the trees. A figure, low and moving with deliberate, furtive speed, darting from one patch of cover to another, a frozen clump of reeds, a boulder half buried in the ice, heading not toward the cabin, but parallel to the creek, northward, away from Harlan's camp, or scouting a flanking position. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. Man or beast? The figure moved like a man, but stayed low, utilizing terrain with practiced ease. Too small for a horse. A scout, sent to get a closer look before the main group advanced? His hand instinctively tightened on the rifle he held. "Ahyoka," he hissed, not taking his eyes off the figure. "Come, look, down by the creek, moving north." She was beside him in an instant, her slight form pressed close to see through the crack. Her sharp eyes focused instantly. She watched the darting shadow for a long, tense moment, then a sharp intake of breath. Not Harlan's man," she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce hope that war with disbelief. Elias glanced at her sharply. "How can you tell?" "The way he moves," she breathed, her gaze fixed with desperate intensity, like flowing water over stone. "Like," she swallowed hard, "like one of ours. Like Willella, my cousin. He hunts the high ridges." Her voice dropped to a barely audible murmur, a prayer and a plea. "Usty gallonage, little hawk." As if hearing her whispered name on the wind, the figure stopped suddenly, crouching behind a large, ice-encrusted boulder near the creek bank. It turned, seemingly looking directly toward the cabin, a dark smudge against the gray dawn. For a heartbeat, two, it remained utterly still. Then, a flash of movement, an arm raised, not in threat, but in a deliberate, sweeping gesture. A signal? A bird taking flight? It was impossible to discern clearly at this distance in the poor light. Before Elias or Ahyoka could react, the figure melted back into the deeper shadows beneath the cottonwoods, vanishing as completely as it had appeared. The creek bed lay empty once more under the cold, watchful eye of the coming dawn. Ahyoka pressed her hand against the ruffle of the wall beside the window, her knuckles white. "It was him," she insisted, her voice a mixture of wonder and renewed terror. "Willella, he saw me. He saw us." Her eyes met Elias's, wide and luminous in the gloom. "But if he is here, where are the others? And why did he show himself?" The hope that had flared so brightly was already tempered by caution. Harlan's men were camped close. Had Willella been seen? Was his signal a warning, or a confirmation of their location to the enemy? Elias stared at the spot where the figure had vanished, the cold knot of dread in his stomach twisting tighter. The appearance of potential allies should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like the first pebble in an avalanche. If Ahyoka was right, her clan was near, moving silently through the pre-dawn gloom. But so were Harlan's men, waiting, watching. And now, one of her own had potentially exposed their position. The fragile standoff was shattered. The gray light creeping over the land felt less like dawn and more like the slow drawing back a shroud, revealing a stage set for violence. Every shadow by the creek, every rustle of frozen sage, now held lethal ambiguity. He scanned the eastern horizon again. The smoke plume seemed thicker, darker, as if the camp was stirring. A sound carried on the wind, not hoofbeats yet, but the distant, unmistakable whinny of a horse. Then another. They were moving. The waiting was over. The cold, gray dawn had arrived, and with it, the reckoning. Elias slowly, deliberately, thumbed the hammer of his rifle back to full cock. The metallic click was the loudest sound in the world. The metallic click of the rifle hammer hung in the frigid air of the cabin, a punctuation mark to the ending night. Outside, the gray dawn bled cold light across the Wyoming plains, leaching color from the frost-silvered sagebrush and casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to creep towards the lone cabin. The hoarse whinnies from the east had ceased, replaced by an ominous, gathering stillness. The smoke plume, now a dirty gray smudge against the paling sky, was the only sign of the enemy camp, but its message was clear. The waiting was over. Harlan's men were moving. Elias remained frozen at the window crack, his eyes scanning the creek bed with a shadow figure. Willella, if Ahyoka's desperate hope was true, had vanished. Nothing stirred now in the cottonwood grove. The frozen creek lay silent and pale. Had Willella been seen? Was a signal a warning intercepted? The silence fell heavier, charged with impending violence. Ahyoka stood rigid beside him, the Henry rifle held awkwardly but with determined grip. The river stone lay forgotten on the cot. Her face was pale, etched with fear, but her jaw was set, her dark eyes fixed on the eastern approach. The fragile calm fostered by her prayer and a rifle lesson had shattered, replaced by the visceral dread of the hunt reaching its climax. "They come," she breathed. A confirmation Elias felt in his bones before he saw the movement. First, a flicker of dark shapes cresting a low rise half a mile east, silhouetted against the sickly dawn light. Then another group, slightly south. 6 riders, maybe 7, emerging from a fold of the land like specters materializing from the gloom. They move at a steady trot, purposeful, spreading out as they advanced, converging on the cabin. The rhythmic thud of hooves on the frozen earth began to vibrate through the cabin floor, a grim drumbeat. Elias pulled back slightly from the crack. "Get down!" Behind the stove. "Now!" His voice was a low rasp, stripped of anything but necessity. Ahyoka didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the dirt floor, pressing herself into the corner where the iron stove met the log wall, pulling the worn wool blanket over her legs as partial cover. She broke the Henry's action, slid a cartridge into the chamber with trembling but determined hands, and closed the lever with a decisive click-clack. She rested the barrel on a stack of split firewood, aiming roughly toward the door, her knuckles white on the stock. Elias saw the terror in her wide eyes, but also the fierce, protective fire he'd witnessed before. She was ready to fight for the sliver of sanctuary she'd found. Elias positioned himself at the opposite corner of the window, keeping his body angled away from potential fire. He thumbed the hammer of his own rifle back to full cock. The approaching riders were close enough now to make out individual details through the frost-rimed glass. Rough coats, slouch hats pulled low, the glint of rifle barrels held across saddles. One rider, slightly ahead and larger than the others, rode with a casual arrogance that radiated menace even at a distance. Silas Rourke. Elias felt a cold knot of recognition tighten in his gut, mingling with the old, familiar taste of violence. The riders fanned out, reining in about 50 yards from the cabin, just beyond the frozen creek. They formed a loose semicircle, blocking the eastern and southern approaches. Rourke nudged his horse forward a few paces, stopping near the lightning-scarred cottonwood. He raised a gloved hand, not in greeting, but in a commanding gesture that silenced the jingle of bits and the stamp of hooves. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the relentless moan of the wind whipping around the cabin corners. "Ward!" Rourke's voice boomed out, rough and carrying easily on the cold air. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, laced with contempt. "Elias Ward, we know you're holed up in there. Open the damn door." Elias remained silent, his finger resting beside the trigger. He watched Rourke through the crack. The man's face was shadowed by his hat brim, but Elias could see the set of his shoulders, the way he casually rested a hand on the pistol at his hip. "Come on out, Ward." Rourke called again, a mocking edge entering his tone. "No need for unpleasantness. We're just here for what belongs to Mr. Harlan. Hand over the Cherokee bitch, and you can go back to playing hermit in your little shack. Nobody needs to get hurt over some savage stray." The word savage hung in the air like poison. Elias saw Ahyoka flinch as if struck, her grip tightening on the rifle. He felt the old, hot rage surge, the rage of his outlaw days, the rage that led to the way of the obsidian arrowhead. He forced it down. Now was not the time for blind fury. "She ain't yours to take, Rourke," Elias called back, his voice carrying flat and cold. "She's under my roof. That makes her my concern." Rourke laughed, a harsh, barking sound devoid of humor. "Your roof? On Harlan's land? You're squatting on a claim, Ward, same as her heathen kin. Nothing here is yours. Not the dirt you stand on, not that shack, and sure as hell not that girl. She's Harlan's property now. Stolen goods." He shifted in his saddle. "Last chance. Send her out, or we burn you out and take her from the ashes. Your choice." Elias scanned the riders. They were tense, hands near weapons, eyes fixed on the cabin. One, a lean man with a scarred cheek, had already unshouldered his rifle. Another, younger, looked nervous, his gaze darting around. They were waiting for Rourke's signal. "Over my dead body," Elias stated, the words dropping into the tense silence like stones. Rourke's posture shifted, the casual arrogance hardening into predatory focus. "That," he snarled, "can be arranged." His hand dropped from his pistol, but a clear signal. The lean man with the scar raised his rifle. Elias didn't wait. He squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Henry was deafening in confined space, the muzzle flash blinding in the dim cabin. Smoke filled the air with its acrid tang. Outside, the lean man jerked violently in his saddle as the heavy slug struck his shoulder. He cried out, dropping his rifle, clutching the wound as his horse shied sideways. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked from the riders, wild shots peppering the cabin logs, shattering the window pane Elias had been peering through. Splinters flew. Ahyoka cried out, ducking lower behind the stove as a bullet thudded into the woodpile near her head. Elias levered a fresh cartridge into the chamber, ignoring the whine of bullets around the window frame. He fired again, aiming at the horse of another rider, sending the animal crashing down in a tangle of limbs and screaming. The dismounted man scrambled for cover behind his fallen mount. Rourke bellowed curses, drawing his pistol and firing rapidly towards a shattered window. Elias felt the wind of a bullet pass his cheek. He fired back, forcing Rourke to duck behind the thick cottonwood trunk. "Keep firing." Rourke yelled to his remaining men. "Pin him down. Jenkins, flank left. Get around back." One of the riders, the nervous younger one, Jenkins, spurred his horse, galloping hard to the south, aiming to circle around the cabin toward its blind side. Panic clawed at Elias. If Jenkins got behind them, he could fire through back wall or the door. He couldn't cover both fronts. He broke cover for a split second, trying to track Jenkins's movement. But a volley of fire from Rourke and another rider forced him back behind the log wall, splinters stinging his face. Ahyoka saw Jenkins break away. She saw Elias pinned. The fear in her eyes crystallized into desperate resolve. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her uncle's words echoing in her mind. Even a rabbit finds teeth when a wolf is at the den. She shifted her aim, tracking Jenkins's galloping form to the remaining intact pane of the west-facing window. The Henry felt alien, terrifyingly powerful in her hands. She remembered Elias's instructions. Smooth. Don't jerk. She focused on Jenkins's back, leading him slightly, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The kick of the rifle was brutal, slamming into her bruised shoulder, making her cry out. The roar was immense. Smoke obscured her view. Outside, Jenkins's horse screamed and stumbled, a dark bloom appearing on its flank. Jenkins was thrown forward over the horse's neck, landing hard in the frozen sagebrush. He lay still, groaning. Elias stared at Ahyoka, momentarily stunned. She met his gaze, her face pale, eyes wide with shock at what she'd done, but also with fierce, trembling defiance. She bought them precious seconds. Rourke, enraged by the loss of his men, roared, "Enough of this! Burn them out! Get the coal oil!" One of the remaining riders, a burly man near the creek, fumbled with a canteen-sized tin canister slung on his saddle horn. This was it. the point of no return. Elias couldn't let them get close enough to torch the cabin. He had to break their charge. He lunged to the door, ignoring Ahyoka's gasp of protest. He lifted the heavy bar just enough to slip out, slammed it back into place behind him, and pressed his back against the rough logs the Henry held ready. He was exposed. Frost crunched under his boots. The cold air bit deep. Rourke and the burly man with the coal oil stared at him from near the cottonwood, momentarily surprised by his sudden appearance. The burly man raised a canister. Elias raised his rifle. Time slowed. He saw Rourke's pistol coming up, saw the burly man's finger fumbling with the canister's cap. He sighted on the man with the fire starter. This was the moment, the kill shot, the path he'd sworn to leave behind. The obsidian arrowhead seemed to burn against his chest. Not that way. The memory of another face, pleading bound, flashed before him. A sharp, whistling thwack split the air. Not a gunshot. Something faster, quieter. The burly man grunted, staggering back, embedded deep in the meat of his forearm. Pinning the coal oil canister against his body was a short arrow fletched with gray feathers. He dropped the canister with a clatter, staring in shock at the shaft protruding from his arm. Rourke whirled, pistol searching frantically for the source of the shot. "Ambush!" he bellowed, pure fury and sudden fear warring in his voice. From the trees, another arrow hissed from the cottonwood grove, striking the ground near Rourke's horse's hooves, making it rear in panic. Then another, zipping past the head of the rider near the fallen horse. The flanking maneuver was reversed. The unseen archer, Willella, was in the grove behind them. Panic seized the remaining riders. The wounded man groaned. Jenkins was still down. The man with the arrow in his arm cursed. Try and pull it free. Rourke fired wildly toward the trees, but the dense trunks and shadows offered perfect cover. "Fall back!" Rourke roared, frustration boiling over. "To the ridge! Now!" He wheeled his horse, spurring it savagely back the way they'd come, not waiting to see if his men followed. The others, wounded and panicked, scrambled to mount or help their fallen comrades, abandoning the coal oil and their downed horses in their haste. The burly man with the arrow in his arm managed to haul himself onto his horse with a pained cry and galloped after Rourke, leaving Jenkins groaning in the sagebrush. The thunder of retreating hooves quickly faded, leaving behind a ringing silence broken only by the moan of the wind, the crackle of the cabin fire leaking to the shattered window, and the faint groans of the wounded man Jenkins lying 50 yards away. Elias remained pressed against the cabin wall, breathing hard, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He scanned the cottonwood grove. Nothing moved, no sign of the archer. Willella had intervened, then vanished back into the land like smoke. The cabin door creaked open a crack. Ahyoka's pale face appeared, the Henry rifle still clutched in her hands, her eyes searching his, then scanning the yard. She saw the retreating dust cloud, the abandoned horses, the groaning man in the sagebrush. Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over her features, followed by a tremble that ran through her whole body. She stepped out, the blanket still draped over her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the cottonwoods. "Willella," she called out, her voice thin but hopeful. "Usty gallonage?" Only the wind answered, sighing through the bare branches. Her shoulders slumped slightly, but fierce pride lit her eyes. Her clan was near, watching, protecting. Elias lowered his rifle, the hammer easing down. The immediate threat was broken, driven off by an unseen ally. But Rourke was still out there. Harlan's greed was undiminished, and a wounded man lay in his yard. He looked at Jenkins, writhing in the frost, then at the arrow still protruding from the frozen ground near the cottonwood. The dawn light, now a harsh, revealing yellow, illuminated the scene. The scars of violence on the land, the spilled coal oil glistening near the tree, the bent spur rowel heavy in Elias's pocket. They had survived the dawn attack, but the reckoning was far from over. The silence now felt fragile, a temporary truce bought with arrows and blood. Where was Conatai? And how long before Harlan's wrath descended again in greater force? The plain stretched wide and empty, but Elias felt the walls closing in tighter than before. The silence after Rourke's retreat was profound, broken only by the wind's mournful sigh through the cottonwoods and the pain groans of the wounded man, Jenkins, sprawled in the frost-bleached sagebrush. Elias remained pressed against the cabin's rough logs, the cold biting through his coat, his senses still screaming from the nearness of death. The acrid tang of gunpowder hung heavy in the dawn air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the spilled coal oil near the lightning-scarred cottonwood. He scanned the grove where the gray-feathered arrows had flown, searching for any sign of Willella. Only the shifting shadows and the skeletal branches met his gaze. Ahyoka stood frozen in the cabin doorway, the Henry rifle lowered but still clutched tight, her knuckles white. Relief wore with a deep, trembling exhaustion in her dark eyes as she stared at the grove. "Usty Gallanage," she called again, her voice thin against the vast emptiness. Only the wind answered, carrying the fading drumbeat of Rourke's retreating horses. Gone, Elias rasped, finally pushing away from the wall, his muscles protesting. For now, he looked at Jenkins, writhing in the sage. Him, though he ain't going anywhere. Jenkins moaned, clutching his leg where his panicked horse had fallen on him. "Help, please." His voice was a ragged whisper, laced with genuine terror, not the cruel swagger of Rourke. Elias exchanged a glance with Ahyoka. Her face hardened, the memory of rawhide bonds and Harlan's men vivid in her eyes. Yet, beneath the anger, Elias saw a flicker of something else. Not pity, but a recognition of shared suffering inflicted by the same greed. She gave a small, sharp nod. Elias approached cautiously, his rifle held loosely but ready. Jenkins flinched, trying to scramble back, pain contorting his young face. Don't shoot. Where's Harlan holed up?" Elias demanded, his voice low and cold. Back east." Jenkins gasped, sweat beading on his pale forehead despite the chill. "Camp near the old trapper's cabin by Bear Rock." Rourke, he was going to bring her. He gestured weakly towards Ahyoka. "Proof leverage for the land agent coming." "Land agent." Elias pressed, kneeling beside him, careful to stay out of easy reach. "Coming next week," Jenkins panted. "From Cheyenne. Harlan needs a Cherokee gone or quiet before he signs the papers." Rourke said, "Make an example." He winced, clutching his leg. Didn't know he'd tie her, leave her like that. Ahyoka had approached silently. She stood a few paces back, her gaze fixed on Jenkins, not with hatred now, but with a weary understanding of his place in Harlan's machine, a small, scared cog. "Your example nearly froze," she stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "Your greed nearly killed me. And others." She looked past him, toward the east, where her people hid or fled. Elias rifled quickly through Jenkins's pockets, finding only a few coins, a twist of tobacco, and a crumpled, grease-stained paper. He smoothed it out. It was a crude map hand-drawn, marking Harlan's claimed territory. A vast swath encompassing Elias's homestead, the creek, and land stretching deep into traditional Cherokee hunting grounds. Scrawled in the corner was a name, Jasper Harlan, Bar H Ranch. And a single word, verified? Verified by who? Elias muttered, holding the map up. By men who never walked this earth? Jenkins just groaned, his eyes rolling back in pain. Hurts bad. Elias stood, pocketing the map. He couldn't leave the man to die in the frost, not like this. But bringing him inside felt like inviting the viper into the den. Before he could decide, a sound, soft as wind over dry grass, came from the edge of the cottonwood grove. A figure stepped into the open. Not Willella, an older man, perhaps Elias's age, but standing with the quiet authority of mountains. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, his long, dark hair streaked with silver, tied back. His face was deeply lined, etched with wisdom and a sorrow as vast as the plains. In his hands, he held a long, unstrung bow. Its wood dark and smooth. Behind him, stepping from the shadows of the trees like spirits materializing from the land itself, were others. Willela, young and watchful, his eyes immediately finding Ahyoka's with fierce relief. 2 older women, and several men, their expressions guarded but not hostile. They moved with a silent grace that spoke of deep connection to the earth beneath the frost. Ahyoka gasped, a sound like a sob catching in her throat. "It do," she cried, the word bursting forth with pure, unadulterated relief and love. "Uncle." Kanatai, the peace chief, walked forward, his gaze sweeping the scene. The bullet-scarred cabin, the spilled coal oil, the groaning white man, the bent spur Raul Elias had unconsciously pulled from his pocket, and finally, resting on Ahyoka, his eyes dark and deep as obsidian, took in her bruised face the lingering fear mixed with defiance, the way she stood beside Elias. A profound sadness, then a fierce, protective pride washed over his features. He stopped a few yards away, his voice a low rumble, calm yet carrying immense weight. "Ahyoka, Osayo, you are whole." It was a statement, a blessing, and a question. She ran to him then, throwing herself into his arms. He held her tightly, his face pressed against the top of her head, his eyes closing for a brief moment. "Ajiyu, little one," he murmured. "Ajiyu, we followed your trail." Willela saw the smoke, saw the wolves circling this den. He looked over her head at Elias, his gaze assessing, unreadable. "You are the rancher, the one who cut the rawhide." Elias met his gaze, the obsidian arrowhead a burning weight against his chest. He felt stripped bare, not just by the Cherokee leader's presence, but by the accumulated weight of the past days. The violence, the fear, the unexpected, fragile bond with the girl he'd freed. "Elias Ward," he said, his voice rough. He gestured toward Jenkins. This one talked. "Harlan's got a land agent coming. Needs you gone before he signs papers claiming all this." He held out the crumpled map. Kanatai took the map, his eyes scanning it with a grim familiarity. He didn't seem surprised. He handed it to one of the women beside him. "Paper," he said, the word holding a world of weary contempt. "It speaks loudly to men who do not hear the wind or the stories the earth whispers." He looked back at Elias. "You stood against the wolves. For one not of our blood. Why?" The question hung in the cold air. Elias looked down at the bent spur rowel in his hand, then past Kanatai to the obsidian arrowhead visible through the open cabin door. The memory surged, unbidden and sharp. A younger Elias, wild and angry, part of a gang terrorizing a settler caravan. A Cherokee man, trying to protect his family, bound and pleading, shot down by Elias's reckless companion, while Elias stood frozen, complicit. The arrowhead had been in that man's medicine pouch. He'd picked it up after, a cursed souvenir that became an anchor of guilt. He lifted his gaze to Kanatai, forcing himself not to look away. "I ran with wolves once," he confessed, the words scraping his throat raw. "Men like Rourke, men who took what wasn't theirs, hurt people who didn't deserve it." He gestured vaguely east, toward the unseen past. "I carried the weight of that. Found this place, tried to bury it. Then I found her." He nodded towards Ahyoka, still clinging to her uncle, bound, like a man I once saw die because men like me did nothing. He met Kanatai's eyes, the shame a living thing within him. Couldn't do nothing again, even if it meant dying on this patch of dirt I got no real claim to. Silence followed his words, deeper than before. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The Cherokee watched him, their expressions unreadable. Ahyoka looked at him, her eyes wide, not with fear now, but with a dawning understanding of the shadows he carried. Kanatai studied Elias for a long moment. His gaze traveled to the arrowhead hanging by the cabin door, then back to the one Elias unconsciously clutched. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, passed through his dark eyes. He stepped forward, past Ahyoka, stopping directly before Elias. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he reached out and gently touched the bent spur rowel still in Elias's grasp. "The wolf's tooth," Conatii said quietly. "You carry it, but you did not bite." He looked pointedly at the arrowhead in the cabin, then back into Elias's eyes. "The stone you carry, it remembers blood, but your hands tonight held life, not death, for my blood." He paused, his voice dropping even lower, filled with gravity that resonated in the stillness. "Envy Duhaya, you are not the wolf anymore, Elias Ward. The past is a heavy burden, but the man who stands here now, he walks a different path." The words weren't forgiveness. Exactly. They were an acknowledgement, a seeing, a recognition of the struggle and the choice Elias had made. Elias felt a tightness in his chest loosen, a weight he hadn't fully realized he carried lightening fractionally. He nodded, unable to speak, the cold air suddenly sharp in his lungs. Conatii turned his attention to Jenkins. "The young wolf whimpers," he observed. "He will tell his story in the white man's town." He looked at Elias. Elias understood. Jenkins, alive and talking about Harlan's methods and the impending land agent, could so slow Harlan's paper conquest. "He will," Elias stated, "or he'll face the law for what was done here." Conatii gave a single, slow nod. He gestured to two of his men. "Take him to the edge of the white settlement. Leave him where he will be found, with his story." He looked back at Elias. Harlan's hunger for land is a sickness that will not vanish with this dawn. His paper wolves will still come. The threat remains. He placed a hand on Ahyoka's shoulder. "We cannot stay. This place is a wound now. We move west beyond the big river, where the paper trails grow cold." Ahyoka looked at Elias, a complex mix of gratitude, sorrow, and determination in her eyes. She stepped away from her uncle and approached Elias. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into the small pouch at her waist. She pulled out the smooth, cool river stone Elias had given her in the depth of the night. She pressed it back into his hand, closing his fingers over it. Then, she reached up and gently touched the obsidian arrowhead hanging from a nail by his door. Her fingers lingered for a moment. "Keep the stone," she said softly. "It holds a cold, and the memory of warmth shared." Her gaze held his. "The arrowhead, it is heavy, but it points forward now, Elias Ward, not back." She offered him a small, sad smile, the first true smile he'd seen on her face. "Watto, for the path you walked, for cutting the rawhide." She turned and walked back to her people. Conatii placed a hand on her back. Willella nodded at Elias, a gesture of respect. The group turned as one, melting back toward the cottonwood grove with the same silent grace with which they had appeared. They didn't look back. Elias stood alone in the frosty yard, the river stone cool in one hand, the bent spur rowel cold in the other. He watched them disappear into the trees, becoming shadows, then nothing, absorbed by the vast, indifferent land. The rising sun, now a pale gold disk above the eastern ridges, burned away the last traces of frost near the cabin, revealing the scarred earth, the spilled oil, the imprints of violence. In the distance, the thin column of smoke from Harlan's camp still smudged the sky, a stubborn stain. He looked down at the river stone in his palm. Ahyoka was right. It held the cold of the Wyoming night, but also the memory of her trembling hands accepting it, the fragile warmth of connection forged in the crucible of fear. He looked at the arrowhead hanging by his door. The weight was still there, the memory of blood, but Conatii's words echoed. "You are not the wolf anymore." The stone pointed forward. He walked inside the bullet-scarred cabin. It felt emptier than ever before, yet strangely different. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the echo of a presence that had changed him. He poured water from the tin bucket into the kettle and set it on the stove. The fire crackled, a small, defiant spark against the vastness outside. He picked up the Henry rifle, leaning it carefully back in its corner. He stood in the doorway, looking out at the empty plains, the cottonwoods standing sentinel over the frozen creek. Harlan was still out there. Greed like that didn't vanish. The land agent would come. The fight for this harsh, beautiful earth would continue. But Elias Ward was no longer just a solitary rancher burying his past in the dirt. He had stood against the wolves. He had protected life. And somewhere, moving silently westward, a young woman carried a memory of the stone, and a people walked free because of the choice made under a cold Wyoming moon. He touched the obsidian arrowhead one last time. Then he turned back to the stove, to the kettle beginning its low song, to the simple act of making coffee in the quiet dawn. The path forward was uncertain, shadowed still by Harlan's greed. But it was his path now, walked with different weight, under a sun that burned away the frost, revealing the resilient earth beneath.